He has distinguished himself in this country, and indeed throughout the world, as one of our foremost economists. Virtually every book that he has written has been widely heralded, and not a few of his books have become seminal works, one of which was entitled The Zero-Sum Society, The Future of Capitalism. It's a long list of great works that he has written. He began his career of teaching at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1968. I assure you, it's a great, great honor to welcome the one and only, an American original, Dr. Lester Thurow.
The year is 1700, 300 years ago. Economic historians tell us that in 1700, there was no significant difference between the per capita income of the richest country in the world and the poorest country in the world. Because in 1700, in every country in the world, 98% of the population were farmers, and every farmer in the world used exactly the same technology. People power, animal power, human and animal manure, seeds collected from the last crops. There were places in the world where the sunshine and rainfall were better, but they just had more people. And in 1700, economic historians think that half the GDP of the world was inside India and China, because half the people of the world were inside India and China. Then in the early 1700s, the French invented, in the late 1700s, the British perfect the steam engine, the first industrial revolution. And with the invention of the steam engine, the economic historian says 8,000 years of agriculture as the dominant human activity have come to an end. And if you want to be rich, as an individual, a company, or a country, you have to play the industrial game. And in Great Britain, where this revolution began in 1780, by 1810, just 3 decades later, the great industrialists of Great Britain were wealthier than the landed dukes, the people who had been the wealthiest people in Great Britain for the previous 1,500 years. If you take a course in economic history, you'll study the second industrial revolution, based on one great idea and one great invention. The great idea was a German idea. In the 1880s, when the Germans were inventing their chemical engineering industry, they invented the concept of systematic investment in industrial research and development based on academic science. That forever changed the nature of technical change, speeded it up, systematized it. It spelled the end of Great Britain as the world's dominant economic power. Because in the 19th century, the British led the world in technology, but it was based on what today I guess we would call entrepreneurial tinkerers. Bessemer, for example, never knew, chemically speaking, what went on inside his blast furnaces. He just fiddled around with proportions till he found something that worked. The great invention, of course, is electricity. And we forget how pervasive that is. If you were in New York during the blackout last summer and had a hotel room, you couldn't get into it because the electronic keys don't work when the electricity is out. Fast forward, it's now the year 2000, 300 years later. In the year 2000, the gap in per capita income between the world's richest country and the world's poorest country is 140 to 1. Not because the poor have become poorer, but because some people leapt into these two revolutions and others didn't. There are about 6 billion people in the world, and tonight, 1.6 billion of them will go to sleep in a house that does not have electricity. First light bulb was sold in 1873. 130 years after this revolution begins, it's still about a third of humanity who's not participating. Now, I believe that 50 years or 500 years from now, an economic historian of that day and age is going to refer to our period of time as the third industrial revolution. This is a revolution based on leaps and interactions between 6 key technologies: microelectronics, computers, telecommunications, man-made materials, robotics, and biotechnology. And if we had time, and I do it in this new book, you could talk about the revolutions coming out of each one of these 6. But the question is, what's going to be remembered as the equivalent of steam or electricity? And oftentimes that would be very difficult to say, but in this case I know precisely what's going to be remembered. I know exactly what that economic or historian is going to say 500 years from now about our period of time. They're going to say in the year 2000, plus or minus because of the Human Genome Project and all of that, for the first time in human history, people could change their own genetic makeup. And that is the most important invention in all of human history, more important than a wheel. We can make ourselves into something different. And we're not talking about something that's going to happen. We're talking about something that is happening. Anybody in this room with small children who would like to can make them 5 inches taller. Human growth hormone, produced by biotechnology techniques, now plentiful, no known side effects, technically illegal in the United States unless your child's a dwarf. But we have families going to the Bahamas and trying to make sons into Bill Waltons, tall enough to play in the NBA. They can only add 5 inches. But we're going to make ourselves into something different. People talk about cloning, but who wants to clone? I don't want another Lester Thurow. I want a better Lester Thurow, right? Now, he didn't cause this revolution, this shift from an industrial economy into a knowledge-based economy, but he's the symbol, he being Bill Gates. For all of human history, the wealthiest person in the world has always commanded natural resources. And I use the word commanded deliberately, because that person was almost always a general or an emperor. Julius Caesar was the wealthiest man in ancient Rome because as the general who conquered Spain, he legally owned all the gold mines of Spain. Sometimes it was the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Sometimes it was the Emperor of China. Sometimes it was the King of Saudi Arabia. And in 1996, it was the Sultan of Brunei. But in 1997, it's Bill Gates. And the question is, what does Bill Gates own? No land, no gold, no oil, no buildings, no machines. He doesn't even own patents. What he does is command the knowledge process. And that makes him the wealthiest person in the world, and depending on the day, and this is one of those days, Microsoft, the most valuable company in the world. This is a symbol of a profound human change. For the first time in human history, you can get fabulously rich by commanding knowledge as opposed to natural resources. Now, that first revolution has led to a second revolution. The second revolution we know is globalization. But it's very important to understand that the world was a lot more globalized 100 years ago than it is today. Because in 1900 was the peak of the colonial empires. In 1900, 25% of the globe, the landmass of the world, was ruled from London. Australia, Burma, India, Nigeria, Canada. 15% was run from Paris. The United States was running Cuba and the Philippines. China had been divided. There were only 40 independent countries in the world. Today there are more than 200. And of those 40, at least half weren't independent because they were in Latin America and under the thumb of the American Monroe Doctrine when it came to their foreign policies. But this is a very different globalization. This is a globalization led by business firms as opposed to governments and armies. Because the modern definition of an economy is I'm looking for the cheapest place to build my product. Over what area do I search? If I search Southern California, it's a regional economy. If I search America, it's a national economy. If I search the world, it's a global economy. And today I search the world. Ask yourself a very simple question. Globalization, as we now know, it's been going on for about a decade. What country has won more from globalization than any other? Obvious answer, mainland China. 1.3 billion poor people growing at 9 to 10% a year, and it wouldn't be happening if they couldn't get capital from the rest of the world, technology from the rest of the world, sell products in the rest of the world. And it brings us to Napoleon in 1808. Napoleon in 1808 said to Lord Robbins in England, China is a sleeping dragon. When it awakes, the world will shake. China has awoken, and the world is shaken. 3 times in the last half of 2003, I went around the world, stopping in 3 or 4, 5 underdeveloped countries each trip. There is only one topic of conversation: things moving to China. You go down to the maquiladoras in Mexico, the television set manufacturing industry for America that used to be in Mexico is all moving to China. You go to Malaysia, Dell is moving all its computer manufacturing from Malaysia to China. There's a third revolution. The third revolution has some magic dates associated with it. 1978, 1989, 1991. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping stands up and says it doesn't make any difference whether the cat is black or white. The question is, does it catch mice? We will abolish the communes and practice capitalism as an economic system. And China joins the capitalist world. 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down and communism disappears in Eastern Europe. 1991, the Soviet Union implodes and communism disappears in its heartland, and 15 non-communist countries emerge. Today, there's only one small, miserable communist country in the world, that's called Cuba. And what we didn't understand is that when communism dies and enters the history books, socialism will be completely discredited. There's not a place in the world you can stand up today without being laughed at and say, I believe that government ought to own all the means of production. And in European countries where political parties had the word socialist in their titles, in almost every country they've had to take that word out of their title in order to get elected. And what we didn't really understand is that when communism dies and socialism is discredited, capitalism will change. Where do you think Darwin got the phrase, survival of the fittest and extinction? He didn't make it up. He borrowed it from a 19th century British economist by the name of Spencer, who believed that what makes capitalism efficient is this battle between companies and individuals to see who's the most efficient and who can drive the other guy into extinction. And by extinction, he meant starvation, and he thought that was a good thing, because you would improve the human species economically speaking if you drove the economically incompetent into starvation. And Darwin borrowed that apparatus for his famous book on biology. Now, we're not going back to survival of the fittest capitalism, but it's very important to understand we're going back to a harsher version of capitalism. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, if you worked for a profitable American firm, you knew there were going to be no mass layoffs. Profitable firms didn't lay people off. But it all changed in the 90s. In the 90s, in each and every year, big, profitable American firms laid off between 600 and 800,000 people per year. Because the bar has changed. The now bar is, what does Wall Street expect? If Wall Street expects 8% rate of return and you earn 6, people are going to be laid off. 0 is no longer satisfactory. Or being slightly above 0 is no longer satisfactory. And in the first quarter of 2004, if big profitable American firms continue to lay people off at the same rate, they will lay off 900,000 people in 2004. These are not firms that are losing money. These are all firms that are big and profitable. Now, those three revolutions have basically blown up every economic fixed point that anybody in this room knows. And what I would urge you to think of yourself is you can't be a leader. Because a leader is somebody who knows he's at point B, knows he wants to go to point A, and the only question is how do you find a route from B to A, and how do you persuade the troops to follow you? You don't know that you're at B and you don't know you want to go to A. You have to think about yourself as an explorer. An explorer is somebody who doesn't know where he is, doesn't know where he wants to go, doesn't know how he's going to get there, but does know he wants to get rich. And in the modern world, you have to be an explorer. And let me give you just 3 examples of the standard business models being blown up. Best first take companies. What's the oldest industry in human history? The first time that one person paid another person to do something. People joke that it's prostitution, but that isn't true. The oldest industry is professional music. As far back as archaeology goes, 8,000 years ago, we know people were paid to sing at weddings, funerals, and religious events, sing and play. This is the oldest industry in human history. What's about to happen to professional music? If you watch CD sales, steep downward curve, minus 13 to 15% a year. Straight line projections are not the way to do sales projections, but if you do them, the last CD in the world will be sold in 2011. And professional music, as we know it, will cease to exist. And we had this dramatically driven home in Cambridge this summer. For as long as anybody can remember, certainly when I was a graduate student at Harvard, there has always been a huge record CD store in Harvard Square. Big footprint, multiple stories. Went broke this summer, closed its doors. 40,000 students at Harvard or MIT, and you can't sell a single CD. Because how do you sell your product if somebody can get it free? If this were your problem, what would you do? The answer is it is your problem. Because I would argue that no matter what business you're in, your business model is going to be blown up just as profoundly as the model in music. And the only question is how fast and exactly how. Nobody's going to be immune from the music problem. National models. Think about the miserable Irish. For all of human history, the Irish have been poorer than the English. For 2,000 years, they've been miserable. Suddenly, 3 years ago, the Irish are wealthier than the English. And today, Ireland is the third wealthiest country in Western Europe. Only Norway and Luxembourg are better. Now, what do you think happened in Ireland to make these miserable people into successful people? The answer is that the Irish, in some sense, either intuitively or intellectually, understood the world they're in. When they joined the common market 25 years ago, Ireland, Portugal, and Greece were the three poorest countries in Western Europe. And about that time, somebody in Ireland sat down and said, we have these miserable Irish companies that make no money. We have a 40% corporate income tax. What's 40% times 0? Well, it's 0. Why do we do that? Why don't we have 0 times 0? That's also 0. So they abolished the corporate income tax. Fast forward 20 years, 25 years. Now you're a foreign company seeking to invest in the European Union. The Irish have the basics. Engineers are a lot cheaper in Ireland than they are in Germany. You got a choice of putting a factory somewhere in Europe. Why wouldn't you go to Ireland? No taxes, and the basics are pretty good. 25 years later, 70% of the Irish GDP is produced by foreign-owned firms. But the Irish are wealthier than the English for the first time in human history. And Portugal and Greece are still the poorest countries in Western Europe. Because the Irish understood the game was different, and you played the game differently. Individuals. I'm going to give you 5 words, I think, that bring terror to the heart of every white-collar professional. It's called white-collar professional offshore outsourcing. Your job can move to India, no matter what your job is and no matter how much it's paid. And I'll give you a Boston example. The gentleman who was the head of radiology at the Mass General Hospital in Boston noticed that, hey, this is an electronic job. MRIs and X-rays are electronics. You send the data electronically to the radiologist. He reads it, sends the report back. I can send that stuff to India. Radiologists in America are paid $400,000 a year. Radiologists in India are paid $50,000 a year. If I were President Bush, this would be my worst nightmare. I think this could very well blow him out of the White House. Because when a factory moves to China, with all due respect, a Republican president can be a little relaxed. Those are blue-collar workers who tend to vote Democratic, losing their jobs. When white-collar professional workers move to India, those are good Republican voters. And at the moment, the numbers are very small, but everybody's scared to death. Now, if you think of this new world with no fixed points, or no known fixed points, I would argue to you that you in the business world need a new executive in your office suites. I'm going to call that executive the Chief Knowledge Officer. If you're in a knowledge economy, who's going to track knowledge? It's not going to be the CEO. They're too busy. It's not going to be somebody doing it by accident. Somebody has to be given the job. Now, when I first started talking about the Chief Knowledge Officer, people would say, give me an example. And I could have given you some small companies, but that wouldn't have cut much ice. But today I have the world's best example. What did Bill Gates do 3 years ago? He demoted himself, depending on how you look at it, from being the CEO of Microsoft to being the Chief Knowledge Officer at Microsoft. And if you ask Microsoft for his job description, they say it is Bill Gates' job to ensure that Microsoft continues to control the channels of knowledge that make Microsoft rich. And at least at Microsoft, they think that's more important than being the CEO. Now, we don't know what this person is going to do because the job's going to be invented and it'll be different from one industry to another. But let me give you a couple of examples of what this job is going to do. Do I make, buy, or sell technology? That's not a job for the chief of research. He makes technology, or she makes technology after he decided to make it. Think of Cisco. Cisco has never done a dollar's worth of research. It buys small companies that have done good research and keeps the people, which is the secret. And during their heyday, they were buying 20 to 25 small high-tech companies a year, which was their research input. Very successful. What's the biggest business mistake made in human history? It's a $559 billion mistake. I know, but nobody in this room has made one that big. It's Steve Jobs' decision not to sell the Apple operating system and be Microsoft in the early 80s. Because the difference in market capitalization between Apple and Microsoft was $559 billion. Now, we won't feel sorry for Steve Jobs because he's still a billionaire, but he could have been Bill Gates. There is a right time to sell, and if you don't recognize it, it passes on and never comes back. Or you're Intel. Intel doesn't buy, it doesn't sell, it makes. And for Intel, that's been the right strategy. I'll give you 3 words, and if you don't know the meaning of 3 words, your company definitely needs a chief knowledge officer. In a knowledge-based economy, it's going to be full of patent wars. Cluster patents, picket patents, submarine patents. Who's going to handle those problems? It's not your patent attorney, who doesn't even know the meaning of those things. They register patents when you tell them to register patents and try and prove that a patent isn't a valid patent when you tell them to do that. But they don't strategically fight the intellectual wars. And when it comes to the intellectual wars, California had a disaster last September in Cancun, and California doesn't even know it. This is a state that relies on intellectual property rights. That's what Silicon Valley is all about. That's what the biology companies in San Diego are all about. But there is no world system of patents. And what you read in your newspaper about the collapse of the WTO meetings in Cancun is it happened because the first world wouldn't give the third world access on agriculture. And that's technically correct, but that's not the disaster. The disaster is that what was supposed to happen at Cancun is we, the first world, will give the third world something on agriculture, and in exchange, they will work with us to establish a viable global system of enforceable intellectual property rights. And since we didn't do the first, they didn't do the second. And it's like a country protecting its past and destroying its future. And we didn't even see it as a disaster. And of course, if I lived in California, I would be marching on the picket lines. Because we don't have a democracy, and you are the worst treated people in America. Let's think of intellectual property rights. Let's assume that the 2 California senators are smart enough to know that California depends on them. So they say, we believe the world should be negotiating about intellectual property rights. At the same time, we now have 25 states, 50 senators, whose combined population is less than that of California. One group of 30-some million Americans has 2 senators, and another group of 30-some million Americans has 50 senators. Now, who do you think those 50 senators represent? Cows. They're the Republican L coming down the Rocky Mountains. Our founding fathers would roll over in the grave, because when they set up the United States Senate, the difference between the biggest and smallest state in terms of population was 4-1. Today it's 140-1. We don't have a democracy anymore. And that's why we protect our past as opposed to protecting our future, because the past has more senators in the United States Senate than the future has senators in the United States Senate. Now let me end by telling you why I picked this title for the book, Fortune Favors the Bold. Somebody before the dinner said that has to be a famous phrase for somewhere. And the answer it is, but I modified it. The famous phrase is fortune favors the brave. And it was the motto of the ancient Roman army, and the number one thing that the drill sergeant tried to inculcate in every trainee in the Roman army. Because the argument was, you're fighting a sword fight and there's a 99% probability he's going to kill you. Keep fighting. What happens if you turn around and try and run away? He stabs you with no risk to himself in the back. If you are brave, you may die. If you are not brave, you will die. Fortune favors the brave. As long as you keep fighting, there's a little chance you'll make it. The minute you try and turn and run, there's a 100% probability of dying. Now, we don't need bravery in that sense, we need boldness. If you are bold, you may economically fail. If you are not bold, you will economically fail. Now, in the book, I go across a whole set of places where we need to be bold, biology and a number of other things, but let me just talk about one. Gender boldness. Why do you think it is in all of human history men have always dominated economies? Go back to a hunter-gatherer tribe. Women gather, men hunt. And of course, you're now hunting with a spear where there's a very big probability that animal is going to kill you. 2 things led men to have the prestige. Children will grow up normal with very few calories. Children will not grow up normal without protein. The guy who provides the protein is more important than the guy who provides the calorie. And villages with many women and just a few men survive. Villages with all men and no women don't survive. You can't afford to let the women get killed by these animals, because if too many of them get killed, the village can't reproduce. You're in an agricultural society. What's the way to get rich? Basically invade the other guy and make him into slaves. There are no Amazons in the world for exactly the same reason. Requires upper body strength. You can't afford to have very many women killed, or the society can't survive, and so men were always in charge of the armies of defeating the enemy. We're in the industrial society. What's the key industry? 1 out of every 10 people worked in it in 1900. Coal mining. There are no female coal miners in the world for exactly the same reasons. We're now in a knowledge-based economy. Tell me a job that requires upper body strength and is very dangerous. There are no such jobs. Today's jobs are brain power jobs, and presumably half the brain power of the world is inside female brains. And so the question is, are you going to take advantage of it, be bold enough, and use those female brains? And let me give you an example of a society that has chosen not to do that. The biggest disaster in the world is Central Africa. The second biggest disaster in the world is the Arab world. 9 out of every 10 countries in the Arab world have falling per capita GDPs, including the richest like Saudi Arabia. The United Nations has just published a book called The Economic, Human, and Social Condition of the Arab World, written by Arab scholars, and when they try and figure out why is the Arab world failing, they point to 2 things. One of them is so dramatic it's very hard to believe, but it's been checked 1 million times and must be true. From the year 950 until now, 1,000 years, fewer books have been translated into Arabic than are translated into Spanish every single year. And they do that because there are about 260 million people in the Spanish-speaking world and about 260 million people in the Arab-speaking world. And so even if you're literate in Arabic, if you haven't lived or studied abroad, you know nothing about the modern world. Now, as I was mentioning at the lunch table, this statistic made me feel kind of good, because I have 2 books in Arabic, which means I'm a significant fraction of the total. The other thing they point to is the Arab world has more illiterate females than any other society on the face of the globe. About 70% of the women can't read and write. How do you play a knowledge-based game when half your population is out of the game? It's more important than that, because that half of the how are you going to have an educated man with an illiterate mother? If God was running the world and said only men or women could be educated, he'd only educate women, because there are more spillovers from educating women than there are from educating men. There is one group of Muslims who believes in educating girls, called the Aswali Muslims, associated with the Aga Khan. A lot of them are in northern Pakistan, where I used to work as a development economist. Boys and girls are educated in separate schools, but they have a nice sign which they put on both schools, both the boys and girls schools. It says, educate a man, educate a man. Educate a woman, educate a family. Fortune favors the bold. If you are bold, you may lose. If you are not bold, you will lose. Thank you very much.